Okay, so this is going to be a bit awkward just because there are people online and there are people sitting here. The people online can't see the people sitting, obviously. Okay, so and I can hear the people online just to make sure that they can hear what I'm saying. Guys, I mean, they should be able to hear you when you're asking questions, but you won't be able to hear them. So if there's any talking to someone in my head, that is probably the voices in my head, yes. Okay, so like we said the last time, we're gonna split the CTG teaching into 2 sessions. One is the theory part. The part is basic, talking about just basics and how things affect CTGs, how does that affect, how does that matter with our monitoring, does it matter with our management, etc. And then the second part is a brief CTG discussion. Today's CTG is not necessarily informative as much as it's, okay, how do we actually interpret CTG? How do we describe CTG? How do we go about teaching in the future as well? Yeah, so first part, basic physiology, very, very, very basic. Those who know me, I mean, if you ask Adam, I love my basics. I love going back to the really, really bottom line. So we're describing the baby, yes? The baby, can you see that? Guys online, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, great, perfect. So as an overview, baby is different from us, yes? In very small ways, nothing major. So it develops inside uterus, immersed in water, yes? It actually matures and grows quite remarkably within a very short span of time. The biggest time that you can grow within, or the fastest you can grow within your life. I mean, obviously that's not always the case, but the fetus undergoes an increase in size in pregnancy and obviously maturation, and it relies on mom for its nutrition and oxygenation. That's the big difference, yes? But we are gonna break down every single thing within the pregnancy and talk about it, because you know what? Everything within the pregnancy, starting from the uterus, actually matters. So the uterus increases in size, being from this to that, this being about 7.5 centimeters to about 35 centimeters at term. Yes? Okay. It also increases in weight, 60 grams to about 1 kilogram at term. Okay. Where does the uterus get its blood supply? Uterine artery. Anything else? So uterine artery, uterine ileus, yes, but anything else? If we clamp off the uterines, does the uterus stop bleeding? So, and the main collateral comes from the ovarian arteries. So on the side, on the sides, yeah, from the infundibulum pelvis, from the aorta directly. That is quite a lot of blood supply as well. So don't underestimate that. When you have a massive PPH, or when we're trying to put a tourniquet for a fibroid, put it all around, yes, to block both supplies. We don't just put it around the uterine. We don't just clamp the uterine in a myomectomy. Does that make sense? Okay. There's a lot of blood that actually comes from the ovarian artery, so don't underestimate that. Okay. And it actually gets its blood supply from underneath, from where the cervix upwards, mostly. That's where the uterine arteries come from. The ovarian comes from the top. But again, the uterus, the main blood supply comes from the cervix upwards. Is that important? Potentially. So, anyone heard about supine hypertension? Yes, I hope. Okay, what is supine hypertension? Okay, you answered the last question, Bina. People online, I'm going to ask you as well. So if you compress the aorta, that's literally blocked off all the peripheral resistance. That is going to cause an increase in blood pressure. It doesn't cause a reduction in blood pressure. It's the compression of the IVC. So basically the blood is going to the lower limbs via the aorta. It can't come back because the IVC is blocked. That's why you get hypotension. There's no blood to be pumped anymore. So there's lots of blood accumulating in the legs. Yeah. Okay. Now, like any muscle, when it contracts, the blood flow to it or through it stops. Yes. So the blood supply to and through the uterus stops during the contraction. Okay. Is that important? Yes, because obviously if you have contractions, that means there is less and less blood flow to the placenta. Yes. Now, the uterus, unlike any other muscle, has a coordinated contraction, which basically means it starts from the top and then spreads lower down. At the beginning of the contraction, it starts from the top, and at the height of the contraction, it's only that's when the point it reaches the lower part of the uterus. Is that helpful? I mean, does that happen for a reason? Do we know why does this happen? So that's one. You get, so the blood supply that comes from lower down gets occluded at the very end of the contraction, rather as in at the height of the contraction for a very short time, rather than throughout the entire contraction. Okay. And actually, if the uterus is cramping, so it's all contracting at the same time, that's not helpful. That's not going to push the baby down. So the top contracting first and relaxing, and the lower part stretching is what pushes the baby down. Okay. While if it's just cramping, that doesn't help you at all. So what happens in theater when you suddenly you're about to do an instrumental, and then baby starts developing a bradycardia or prolonged deceleration, as we should be calling it? What usually happens? Come on, guys, rev up a contraction. Yes? Is that helpful? Rubbing up a contraction is very, very helpful when you have a PPH, because it causes a tetanic contraction of the uterus. Okay? Because everything just cramps, closes all the blood vessels, hence you stop bleeding. Brilliant. Okay. You want to rub up a contraction to get this lady to deliver the baby. You have just made the uterus hold that baby in place. It can't come out. The baby literally cannot come out. Okay, so that's one. So it's not helping you deliver. Two, have we ever dealt with a hypoxic mom? Yes, I hope. Yes. Anybody come in with a pillow and cover her face? No, it doesn't work that way, no? That's exactly what we just did to the baby. So the baby was hypoxic, it had a prolonged deceleration, and we just rubbed up a contraction, a tetanic contraction, stopped all the blood supply to the placenta. So we literally just held the pillow on top of the baby's face. Just get her to push. Just get her to push. Yes, pushing is much better when there's a uterine contraction. But if there's a prolonged deceleration, A, flip the bed. She's probably in too much supine for the happiness of the baby. And B, if you really want this baby, I'll just get her to push. Yeah? Uterine contractions is a factor that helps you deliver the baby. It's not the only one. Maternal effort is important. Remember, you're pulling from the other side as well. Yeah, so get that to work with you, rather than getting the uterus to clamp the baby in, hold it so it can't come out, and make it more hypoxic. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else about the uterus? Not that I can think of. Okay, placenta. So uterus, placenta. The placenta is what provides oxygen for the baby. Yes, it's what provides nutrition for the baby, and it protects the baby from toxins. Okay, the placenta is actually what maintains the pregnancy. The placenta is actually more important than the pregnancy. If you have no placenta, you have no pregnancy. If you have no placenta, you have no baby. If the placenta dies, separates, etc., you have no baby. And the placenta works at maintaining the pregnancy from the very, very beginning. Yes, HCG that comes out from the beginning, that's placenta. Yes, that's what maintaining pregnancy from to start with. Progesterone, until once it starts producing its own progesterone, that's when the corpus luteum dies away. Our big problem, the human placenta lactogen, it's what provides nutrition for the baby, what breaks down mom's carbohydrates, etc., and produces more glucose for the baby because babies can't metabolize anything else but glucose. Now, interestingly, the baby develops trust issues from the very, very beginning. So the placenta makes sure that baby is getting good blood flow throughout the pregnancy. It's the placenta that does that. And the way it does that is that from the very, very beginning, once the trophoblasts are developing, they initially invade mom's blood vessels. Okay, why? I thought we want more blood supply. Yes, I love my mom, but I can't trust her. In stress, adrenaline comes out from all of us and it blocks off all our blood vessels. It causes the blood vessels to vasoconstrict. I can't have that. Yes, I love her, but I can't trust her. Okay? Trust issues start very early on. Yeah, no, I can't say that to my mom, never. So what the placenta does, it actually goes out and blocks all the blood vessels that are supplying the placenta. That's crazy. Okay? And what it does, it actually goes inside the wall of the blood vessels and eats away all the muscle layer. And when it opens again, it has wide blood vessels that have low resistance and mom has no control over them. So that regardless of what's happening, I can get my blood supply. Yeah, so trust issues, but being smart about it, yes? Okay, what happens if I fail in this? What happens if this doesn't happen? Preeclampsia, placental insufficiency. Yes? Okay. Yes. they just had too much trust. Okay. The placenta during labor acts as a reservoir. We all talk to women about when the uterus contracts, the oxygen supply to the baby stops. Actually, that's not entirely true. So when the uterus contracts, the spaces within the uterus act as a reservoir that the baby can still access and get blood supply from. Yes, the placenta is not getting oxygen anymore, but the placenta has enough store usually to maintain the baby throughout a contraction. And while there's a contraction, the baby starts using this oxygen reserve.
Okay, you're doing teaching. Okay,
So, yes, busy morning. Yeah, so we're talking about the placenta being a reservoir for the contraction, and it usually lasts for about 90 seconds. If the contraction is lasting more than that, the baby starts running out. Now, baby's own oxygen reserve, so within its circulation, it has another about 90 seconds within. But if it's going more than 90 seconds, you know the placenta's run out. Okay? Is there a way of knowing whether the wave of invasion and placenta function is potentially okay? You know? So there are lots of tests that we actually do. So first trimester, do we know what low PAP-A is? What's PAP-A? Do you know what PAP-A is? It's a protein produced by the placenta. Yeah, we tested during the first trimester to check how the overall placenta function is, okay? And we can use that in other things like trisomies and screening for that. Yeah? Okay, so if somebody has an isolated, just a low PAP-A, is that important? Do we bother with that? Do we take that into any account? Yeah. So that's why we follow them up. That's why we give them aspirin. That's why we do what we look at. What you try and arch Dopplers for everyone, but that's why we make sure it's something that we keep in mind. That's why we do growth scans. Yes. Okay. So that's first trimester. What about second trimester? Is there a way of figuring out whether the placental function is okay? You try and arch Dopplers. Okay. So why are we doing uterine arch Dopplers? What are we doing there? Yeah. What are we looking for? Higher resistance and notching. Okay. So, but why? How does that come into the mix? We're looking for placenta functional. Why am I doing the uterine artery? No. So if you do the Dopplers for any artery, most arteries have high resistance. Most arteries have notching. The reason being is that the muscle layer, when any muscle, if you stretch it, it recoils back, like the knee jerk, yes? So the uterine artery, just like any other artery in the body, has a muscle layer and has high resistance because it's an artery. But what did the baby do at the very beginning, at the placenta do at the very beginning? It invaded all those muscles to reduce the resistance. So you should have a low resistance vessel or a low resistance flow now, because the uterine artery has no resistance afterwards, and there's no muscle layer, so there's no recoil, there's no notching. That's why you don't do the notching or uterine Dopplers in the first trimester. It's obviously going to be there. You do it in the early second or even later in second trimester. Does that make sense? After the waves of invasion. If you do it before the waves of invasion, there's obviously going to be high resistance. There's obviously going to be notching. You have to wait for the placental invasion before you can do the notching. Does that make sense? If you have high resistance or you have notching, it means that the placenta has not invaded properly. There is still some muscle layer there, and the mom can still reduce the placental blood flow. So this baby can potentially have reduced reserve, chronic hypoxia. Does that make sense? Okay. I love this bit, the umbilical cord. You have to talk about everything, no? So the umbilical cord is what connects the baby to the placenta, yes? Okay. It's formed of 2 arteries, 1 vein, connective tissue around both, okay? Wharton's jelly, and amniotic membrane from the outside. Now, what I love about the cord is the architecture, is how the cord is actually designed. So the cord is actually what brings the oxygenated blood to the baby from the placenta. The vein, okay? And obviously then the arteries take the deoxygenated blood from the baby to the placenta, yes? So, okay, let's think about the design. So we have a vein that is completely straight, okay? Has a lower pressure than the arteries, okay? And that's supposed to be bringing the most vital thing. So this is what baby relies upon. If you have a straight vessel with low pressure, what can happen to it? It can get compressed, okay? That's a problem, okay? For design, okay. So to make sure that the vein always remains patent, or most of the time, or it's less likely to get squashed, the arteries are spiraling around the vein. So they are higher pressure on the outside, just like our ribs and the heart being protected inside. So you're less likely to be able to squeeze the cords because the arteries are spiraling on the outside. The arteries also have a pulsatile motion, which means that it slithers away, especially with the amniotic membrane around, which is very slippery. You can't easily squash that cord. Okay, interesting question. What drives the blood from the baby to the placenta? Okay, that's the easy question, guys. The next. Say that again. Yeah. Yes, the fetal heart. The fetal heart pumps the blood from the baby to the placenta. Okay. So ready for the difficult question. What drives the blood from the placenta to the baby? Yeah, the placental heart, obviously. Yes. But mom's blood and blood pressures are not connected to baby in any way. No, they don't actually mix. There's a barrier there. So there's the pressure from mom doesn't cross to baby. So you're saying the heart is driving the blood to the placenta and back. If that was the case, you would have a pulsations in the vein. Why is venous pulsations abnormal then? Okay, what drives the blood back from our legs? Calf muscles, potentially. Does that mean that if I'm not contracting my calf muscles, my blood is just stagnating there? Okay. And by the way, the placenta has no muscles. So what else drives the blood back from our legs? Inspiration, the negative pressure when we take a deep breath. That brings the blood, most of the blood back from our legs. When you take a deep breath, that brings a lot of blood back from your legs. Having said that, baby doesn't take deep breaths inside, so that again doesn't work. Okay, so well, that doesn't even work for baby because no, what brings the blood back from our legs is when you take a deep breath, it sucks the blood back from our legs because it creates negative pressure in our chest. But the baby doesn't take that much of deep breaths. Yes, it does shallow breathing, not enough to keep this circulation going, and it's not even breathing all the time. So what brings the blood back? No one ever thought of this? Negative pressure from where? Myometrium. If you have negative pressure in the myometrium, you're going to suck the blood all to fill the placenta. Come on, guys. Just think outside the box. From the placenta to the baby. No. So, no. So the pulsation of the vein, the arteries, the pulsations of the arteries, the arteries being coiled around the vein, those pulsations siphon the blood back. So that creates a negative pressure within the vein, pulling the blood back. Wicked. Yeah. So the fact that it's pulsating around brings the blood back. Yes. I don't generally tend to say new stuff. It's actually all basic, very basic. But it's an amazing creation. I really love how it's created. Its architecture is amazing. So the blood flows from the baby to the placenta by the baby's heart. It's pumping, so it pumps the blood to the placenta. The pulsations of the artery, the fact that it's spinning around, that creates a negative pressure in the end of the vein, and that brings the blood back from the placenta to the baby. Very cool. So what happens to the baby that has a single artery? Do you think that's going to have the same flow? They're absolutely fine, but they are more, sorry? Unless they're under more stress, unless they're under more, they're easily get more cord compressions. So that's why we monitor them. That's why babies with single umbilical arteries, we put them on continuous monitoring to see how they're responding, whether they're getting well oxygenated or not. I think so. Yes. I thought we still do that. I'm not a fetal medicine person, but to my basic knowledge, that's why we should be if we weren't. And I think it's a good idea. I don't think we should stop scanning them. That's you. Yes, and it usually is. Okay, obviously there's lots of water and jelly around, and it's covered by amniotic fluid to make sure it slips away. You can't really squash something if it keeps on moving. Yeah. Okay, So we talked about the uterus, we talked about the placenta, the cord, amniotic fluid. So amniotic fluid is protective. Yes, it protects baby from trauma. It protects it from compression. So it spreads all the pressure on the entire surface of the baby. And it is aseptic. There's usually no bacteria within. And it is antiseptic. It prevents infections, which is why it becomes more important, or becomes very important, when you have prolonged strom, because your antiseptic solution that is surrounding the baby is mostly drained, or if there's meconium, because meconium can inhibit the antiseptic properties of the amniotic fluid. Plus, meconium is a very rich environment. Obviously, it's also an irritant, etc., etc. So I'm not going to go into too much detail in that for now. Okay, we've talked about every single thing within this pregnancy except for baby. That's crazy. We're monitoring baby. So let's talk about baby's circulation. We're monitoring baby's heart. We're monitoring this baby's oxygen supply. Let's just talk about the circulation. So the fetal circulation is significantly different. Yes. And it is specifically modified to suit the purposes of the baby and the needs for the baby. And the fact that the baby has its lungs outside its body, if you understand what I mean. Yes, baby's not breathing by its lungs, it's breathing by its placenta. So an adult circulation, we say, runs in series. All the blood that comes to the heart goes to the lungs, to the heart again, and through the body. Okay, but baby circulation runs in parallel. It has two almost separate circulations that almost run completely separately. And baby can move blood from one side to the other quite quickly. Let's just have an overview. I'm not entirely sure why this is not moving anymore. So we start off with the placenta. That's where we're going to start off the circulation. Blood goes to the baby through the umbilical vein, bypasses the liver, yes, ductus venosus, and then joins the inferior vena cava into the right atrium, yes? Okay, now baby has something quite different from us. It has something called laminar flow, as in the blood that comes through the ductus venosus goes almost straight to the left atrium, and it doesn't mix as much with the deoxygenated blood that's coming from the inferior vena cava. That has to do with pressures and the actual viscosity of the blood. Too complex, don't worry about it. More oxygenated blood just goes straight into the left atrium, okay? While less oxygenated blood goes into the right ventricle. Okay, which means that the blood that is in the left ventricle is more oxygenated than that's in the right ventricle, because there's also the superior vena cava coming down onto the right ventricle as well. Making any sense? Okay, why is that important? Because, okay, that's the left ventricle supplies mainly two things. Okay, one, the heart, the coronaries. So the first thing that the heart feeds, the moment it beats, the coronaries itself. That's the first blood vessel that leaves the aorta, yes? Okay, so this is the highest concentration of oxygen ever within the baby, goes straight to the heart and to the brain, okay? The rest of the body, including lungs and everything else, gets the less oxygenated blood that's coming from the right ventricle and what's left of the left ventricle. Okay, now, most of the blood that's actually leaving or going to the body is not going to reach the body. Most of it is actually going to go back straight to the placenta, okay, to be reoxygenated. So the body is actually getting quite little oxygen. Let's talk about that a bit more. So we agreed that adult circulation different from fetal circulation, yes? Okay, now the baby has a cardiac output of about 1,500 milliliters per minute. Okay. We have about 7 5 to 7 liters per minute. Does that mean we have a higher cardiac output? Baby's blood volume is about 350 milliliters in total. So baby actually circulates its blood volume 5 times per minute. That's crazy high cardiac output, okay? And when we describe baby's cardiac output, we don't talk about just the stroke volume or the cardiac output. We talk about the combined cardiac output. Remember, there are 2 parallel series. They work almost in parallel. They're almost not related. Okay, yes, you can switch blood from one to the other, but they're almost unrelated. So we always talk about the combined cardiac output, okay? Left ventricle produces about 35% of the combined cardiac output, so about 1/3, and right ventricle 2/3, okay? The heart takes about 3%, and the brain takes about 26%. So heart and brain take almost the entire volume produced by the left ventricle. So the highly oxygenated blood goes almost completely to the heart and brain. Nothing else benefits, almost separate, okay? A tiny bit left joins the descending aorta, that's 63%, okay? 8% goes to the lungs. That's interesting. I thought lungs were not important in pregnancy, in intrauterine life. Why does it take 8%? It's taking more blood volume than the heart. It needs to develop. It undergoes huge amounts of development and maturation, which is why babies that have IUGR, they may suffer. They suffer throughout, okay? But when they're born, they can still suffer because the lungs are not well developed, if it's severe enough, okay? Luckily, the lungs is one of the last things that gets affected. If you remember the distribution, the lung gets its blood supply the moment it leaves the right ventricle. So it's very difficult to get blood away from the lungs. It's maintained until almost the last thing before heart and brain. Does that make sense? Okay. So the lung takes quite a lot of oxygen. 63% is going to the rest of the body, and 41% of that goes back to the placenta. The entire body, everything else, hands, legs, hair, skin, bowel, 22%. So the entire body takes actually less than the brain. Interesting. Also, entire body, bar, heart, and lungs takes less than the brain. Okay. Is that important? Does that help us in any way? Is that important for monitoring? So we said that the baby has to maintain its vital organs. Yes, it can get all this blood supply, because remember, the deoxygenated blood that's coming from the inferior vena cava still has some oxygen within. So if we get that 65% into the left ventricle, so if the placenta supply stops, okay, you can still get some more oxygen from the deoxygenated blood that's coming back. It's not zero oxygen. It can still get some more oxygen from it, okay? And remember, the aorta has no valves. So it can potentially go both ways. But more importantly, the baby's heart can easily fill up one side in comparison to the other. So baby can literally decide to fill up most of its volume into the left ventricle. And then the 35% becomes 90%. And the right ventricle only gets 10%. It can do that. We can't do that, but the baby can. Okay, and the way it does that, it blocks off the other side. So basically, if it does vasoconstriction to its periphery, the right ventricle can't fill up anymore. The left ventricle fills up. So the adrenaline response for baby literally moves all the blood, can move all the blood to the left ventricle. Yes. Fetal circulation, okay? Any questions? Okay, so in addition to the circulation being favoring or being very special, baby has its own special hemoglobin. Yes, so it has something called hemoglobin F, which can carry more oxygen and can extract more oxygen from mom at any given oxygen tension. So regardless of how mom is hypoxic, baby can still get some oxygen from her. Okay. Not only that, baby's hemoglobin is actually much higher than mom. So it has relatively more carrying capacity than mom. So not only the hemoglobin can extract more oxygen, it actually has more carrying capacity per milliliter. Now, hemoglobin is important for oxygen carrying, but it's also important as a buffer. When the baby is doing anaerobic metabolism, the acid that comes out is damaging. It can kill the cells. It can damage the cells. It can damage brain cells. It can damage peripheral cells. Okay. Hemoglobin is very important to make sure that this baby is neutralizing that acid and it's not leaving it to damage the cells. Okay. So what happens when a baby is anemic? It has less of a buffer. It also has less oxygen to carry. So it's doing more anaerobic metabolism, producing more acid. And it's not just that it's producing more acid, the acid is damaging relatively more than a non-anemic baby. That's why babies with chronic hypoxia are in a lot of trouble, because they're already coming in, already hypoxic, their oxygen is not great, they're potentially more anemic, they're already having oxygen deprivation, they're already producing more lactic acid, and they have less buffer to work against that. So if they become any more hypoxic, they die, or they get severely damaged. Does that make sense? We always like talking about fetal behavioral states. So just a brief description about what behavioral states looks like. The 3 behavioral states that we always talk about. One is active sleep, which is the most common. This is what normal textbook actually describes as the awake baby, actually. So it's the baby that has normal baseline rate, normal variability. Remember, it's always, when you talk about baseline rate, it's always for this baby, okay? And there's moderate amount of accelerations. So there are some accelerations that are happening. Baby can still move. It's the REM sleep for the baby, okay? What we talk about when we talk about sleep patterns, we talk about the deep sleep. Yeah, it's the non-REM sleep. And this can last for up to about 50 minutes. How long were we asleep last night? Not much. Okay, but more than 50 minutes. So why are we saying that baby can only sleep for 50 minutes? So it's the sleep cycle. So the sleep cycle is about 90 to 120 minutes. The deep sleep part of it is only about 50. Yeah? So you shouldn't have very deep sleep or that kind of sleep for more than 50 minutes. Okay. And it looks like, again, normal, stable baseline. It may actually be slightly lower. When we go into deep sleep, our heart rate settles. Yes, the sympathetic switches off a bit. The variability is not that great, and there's rare accelerations. There shouldn't be decelerations on that trace at all. Okay. Active wakefulness is actually the most rare of traces or of states. Okay, normal variability, baseline can actually be slightly higher than normal, because when you're active, your baseline rate is usually slightly faster. That's just like us. So the baby is exactly the same. Yeah, and if there's so many accelerations, it can become quite difficult to interpret the trace and figure out the baseline. But what we always have to notice is that the baby is cycling. Yeah. Okay. So basic bit done. Very dull theory.
If the heart is therefore then only pumping to the left ventricle as much and the right side is kind of being underused, is that discrepancy also outside, like the baby's born?
It can be. So those babies can end up with pulmonary hypertension. So all the blood vessels are literally closed. It can, if it's very severe, it can be long term. That's why babies, when they come out, they have so the IUGR babies already are small. Their muscle mass is not that great. Their fat underneath is not that great. So it takes, they can put that back on, but it takes quite a lot of work and effort and redistribution again. So as I said, the problem with those is even if you want to resuscitate them, you actually can't, because the lungs are not working properly, their body is not working properly. They end up with more problems like neck, yeah. Their bowels have been necrotic for most of their life. Remember, one of the things that happens once they're delivered, that hemoglobin F starts converting to our adult hemoglobin. So their oxygen carrying capacity is dropping, normally because they don't need that much oxygen anymore. As in, there's a lot of oxygen around them. Now they can actually breathe, they can get more oxygen, so they don't need the hemoglobin F. Too much oxygen is also damaging, by the way. So it has to be a balance. But the problem with an IGR, resuscitation is a problem if it's already on the damage pathway. Okay, guys online, are you still following? Are you still there?
Yep.
Do you guys have any questions?
No, it's really good.
All good.